Before we begin, a warning that the following episode contains sensitive content about eating disorders, suicide, and some strong language.
I'm basically really scared of taking my top off, and that's why I hate summer.
I had a 22-year military career and struggled with bulimia throughout.
I'd put my belt 2 notches tighter, so my weight was always a reminder for me.
These are all quotes from men, not the voices that you might have been expecting, behind statements that speak of huge insecurities around body image and weight. But the truth is, men get eating disorders too. In fact, about a third of people with eating disorders are male, although statistics massively underestimate the rates of EDs among men because they are simply just overlooked when it comes to research. But it would be silly to assume that a mental health disorder can only affect just one gender, right? But because eating disorders are typically seen as only affecting women, this stereotype makes it even harder for men to be taken seriously when it comes to seeking help. That is, if they even feel like they have the confidence to. In this podcast, we will hear the stories of 3 different men, Richie, Dave, and Tom, and hear firsthand what it is to be a man with an eating disorder. We'll also be speaking to a clinical psychologist and researcher about the theme of masculinity today and what they believe can be done to help males open up more about their mental health. This is Richie's story.
It was quite a kind of long journey on many different parts, and a large part of that journey was like zero idea what was going on. So I'm 26 now, and from the age of 19, that's when the emotional binge eating really started. The body image stuff had started actually before that, but that's really when the actual behavior started. And so between the years of 19 and 24, I was binge eating, but I didn't know what was going on. I thought it was just this thing that I needed more discipline. I just needed to find a new diet, find a new way to control it, cut out carbohydrates, stop eating after 9, calorie count stricter, intermittent fasting. Used all these kind of toolkits, never once thought it was like a psychological issue.
Richie never even considered that his strange binging habits could be an eating disorder until he struck a crisis point and ate 10,127 calories in just 21 hours. And that's when he knew he had to try and work out what was going on.
Then when I was 24, that's when it spilled over it just became much more extreme, much weirder. During the day, it previously only been during the nighttime. And it coincided with a lot of like kind of deeper stress and deeper questioning of what I was doing in my life and where my life was going, because my first company was, in my eyes, failing at that point. And so this kind of coalesced into this more extreme binge eating. And then that's when I finally, for whatever reason, kind of typed it into Google. And for whatever reason, I hadn't done that in the previous 5 years. Google was very good and hits you with the NHS page. And so I was like, shit, yeah, that's me. But
Richie wasn't the only one. Dave and Tom were also unaware that their odd patterns of behaviour were because of an eating disorder. Tom struggled with bulimia from the age of 14, but it wasn't until he was 24 that a GP told him his compulsive over-exercising was due to bulimia.
The symptoms were a bit atypical in my case, because I don't purge through vomiting very often. It mostly kind of purged through like obsessive exercise. And so what would happen is I would binge in private, in secret. I'd do things like when I was at work, I would do circuits of all the different shops so that no one would notice how much food I was buying. And then when I was at home, like I'd eat and like I just like binge in the middle of the night. When things get really bad, it's not really about what the food is, it's just really about the action of putting stuff in my face. So it's more like I'll eat like dry pasta. So like if my teeth can literally break it, like that'll be it. Like so I'll binge and then I'll be a panic attack. Where I'm like, oh crap, what did I just put in my body? And then I have to get rid of it somehow. And then I'll get into like this loop of like, well, I just like train a little bit of it off, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and then more, and then I've done, whatever else I've done, like gone how many burpees or whatever.
And for Dave, who struggled with anorexia, the notion that men could even suffer from it was entirely alien.
I didn't really associate with the term anorexic for quite a long time, and it kind of was something that sort of phased in and out. And all of again, one of the reasons I didn't realize is anorexia was something that happened in glossy magazines or on TV or radio, and I was just a little fat kid in the Midlands bumbling along with my life. But I started weighing myself once a day, but that was always in the morning, and that was before I'd eaten anything. So, and that felt like cheating. So I started weighing myself in the evening, and I was amazed how much my weight fluctuated. So then I started going home. I lived in a little village. I used to go home over lunchtime and weigh myself there. And then I started skipping lessons to go home to weigh myself, because I couldn't really concentrate, because I was constantly thinking, oh my God, I had earlier on, I had a Diet Coke, and I know that was X many calories. Will that have put on weight?
For the majority of guys with eating disorders, this feminine illness stereotype around them means that men are much less likely to be able to self-diagnose and proactively seek help from a GP. There have been so many studies that have highlighted the significant lack of gender-appropriate information for men with EDs, which only creates an additional barrier for men to make sense of their own behaviours. Although the prevalence rates for anorexia and bulimia are higher in women than men, it is estimated that around 40% of binge eating disorder cases are male. And because men present with what looks like a healthier weight, even if they are bulimic or anorexic, GPs often misdiagnose their eating disorders as depression or something completely different. Dr. Iakovina Koutoufa, a clinical psychologist in London, says that men are often overlooked for symptoms of eating disorders primarily because of their gender.
I mean, if we think about it, it was only in 2013 when the latest diagnostic manual of the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, was published, that actually the cessation of periods was dropped as an essential criterion for anorexia. So that means before 2013, in order to be diagnosed officially with anorexia, you had to be a woman, right? Because men don't get periods. The other thing also, we know that binge eating disorder, again, it only became a formal diagnosis in 2013 with a new manual. So if we look at prevalence rates, anorexia and bulimia have much higher prevalence rates in females than males, but for binge eating, the prevalence rates are very similar. So essentially, if you if you don't have a diagnostic category for binge eating, again, you're kind of excluding men who might have been struggling with eating disorders.
The triggers behind developing an eating disorder are incredibly complex for both men and women. A lot of the time, it's about control, which is sadly why there has been a dramatic surge of emergency hospitalizations for both of the sexes during the lockdowns compared to 4 years ago. But for Dave, his gender played a large role in his development of anorexia.
When you stop feeding your body, you also stop feeding your brain, and that can starve out unwanted emotions and things, which is, sometimes it can be a response to trauma, etc. For me, I tried to starve out my masculinity and my sex drive. I hated being a man, and I certainly hated being a sexualized man. And those chemicals are very power hungry. And when your brain is starved and famished, you don't have any of those chemicals. So yes, my gender does come into it, but actually in a weird about turn way of that I didn't like being a man. I was ashamed of being a man, and actually starving that out made me camp, made me stupid, made me less of a threat to women.
Although young people today are constantly challenging the stereotypes around gender, this lad culture and the idea that real men must be unemotional, have bursting muscles and not show weakness, it's still very much there. Tom's overexercising was never considered odd by himself or his friends, because to a lot of men, to really push yourself in the gym excessively is seen as good.
Binging in a certain way is also part of lad culture. So like excess, not just in food, but in drink and, whatever else, because this was what happened with me, right? I just got a reputation as someone who would just eat everyone's food when they didn't want it anymore. I became I was just the bin, right? Like I was the equivalent of the puppy with the scraps or whatever. And no one ever noticed how just the sheer kind of unfeasible volume of food that entailed me eating. But I just became a thing that I almost became that my friends just found endearing about me. So to a certain extent, like, I was then reluctant to kind of view it as anything dangerous or damaging, even when I was having a panic attack, getting into like some sort of suicidal thought loop, just at the prospect of eating like another drumstick or whatever, even while I was like chewing through the bones of the last one.
Certainly now there are more and more high-profile celebrities like Freddie Flintoff and Roman Kemp who are openly talking about their struggles with mental health, encouraging men to show vulnerability and ask for help. Dr. Russell Delderfield is a researcher in critical men's studies and eating disorders at the University of Bradford. His work centres around masculinity and the way that sociocultural expectations of gender can bring about eating disorders, and ultimately is what deters men from talking about their mental health.
I do think we're seeing some changes. I think we're seeing that there's more safety in expressing yourself as a man in a slightly larger variety of ways. But right now, I mean, look at men's bodies. I mean, if you don't have veins popping and every imaginable contour of a muscle showing, you're now called a dad bod. You know, you might be a fit, relatively lean, young to middle-aged man, but unless your muscle is as accentuated as it appears in images, then you're not at your full peak of fitness. And no one ever talks about the people who are photographed and filmed looking like that go through excruciating methods to get that level of muscularity.
Perhaps the problem isn't with masculinity, but with mental health, that it's viewed as a problem if you have trouble with it. After all, everyone has mental health, but not everyone has good mental health, and I think Dave put it wonderfully in this next clip.
I think the fact that we only talk about mental illness rather than talking about mental health is really detrimental as well, because I think a lot of lads, in inverted commas, to use gender stereotypes, actually put that as an otherness. Mental illness isn't about, you know, your dramatic swooping camera shots. It's actually a mundane, boring disinterest in life. So I think there's that. People keep on saying just talk, which I think is a lovely sentiment, but you know what, if we are going to go with gender stereotypes, if a child falls over and hurts their knee, they will go to mummy. They are the carers, they are the emotional ones generally, whereas if they need discipline or punishment, you wait till your father gets home. The dads will fix the situation. Following those same tracks, blokes don't get as much emotional literacy, emotional intelligence, and an emotional language. So what I mean by that is, if I have a pain in my stomach, I can say it's sharp, it's thudding, it's localized. Whereas if I have a problem with my mental health, I've never been given any of the words to explain how that is.
So what next? Men are being hugely overlooked in eating disorder research, and that needs to change. Dr. Russell is calling for more qualitative research about male eating disorders, rather than reducing what are some very complex experiences down to just statistics.
We need to dramatically overhaul all of the medical training in this country, not just because of eating disorders in men, for many reasons, but that is a prime example that there is a negligible amount of training for eating disorders. If you are a primary care physician, if you're a GP, I just feel it's not about blaming those people, but it is about, well, what are we doing to help them be better at spotting those things? And I don't think we're doing very much.
The truth of the matter is, if one wishes to find in-depth analyses of women's experiences of eating disorders and their stories, there is decades of research going back to the 1980s. The same cannot be said about men, and it is not only holding the medical profession back, but men themselves from being able to seek help. And this has to change as soon as possible. If you need support with an eating disorder, visit beateatingdisorders.org.uk or call the Beat helpline on 080 8801 0677. Remember, it's good to talk.